Before the heat is gathered, the plain lies gray and level under a paling sky, the flat black soil country of the Baal, stretching away on every side without a hill to break it, so that the line of the land and the line of the sky meet far off in a single low seam, and the eye travels out and finds nothing to rest upon but the faint rise of ground on which the town was set. This is the head of the Gulf of Khambhat, the wide shallow bay where the great estuaries of Gujarat open toward the western sea, and the land here is the gift and the burden of water, laid down as silt by the rivers and worked over by the tide, a ground so even that a man might walk a day across it and feel he had not moved. The Gulf itself is a sea of moods, for the tides that run into its narrowing head are among the most extreme of any coast, rising and falling many meters between the ebb and the flood, and driving the salt water far up the river mouths in a brown surge, so that the boundary of land and sea here is never a fixed line, but a thing that breathes in and out twice a day across the flats. In the third millennium before the present era, the sea reached nearer than it does now, and a tidal creek of the Sabarmati system carried the salt water up almost to the edge of the settlement, while the small river the later people called the Bogavo ran close at hand with its sweeter flow, so that the rise stood between two kinds of water, the brackish reach of the Gulf on the one side and the fresh water of the inland streams on the other. It was a meeting place of waters, and the people who came here chose it for that, for the firm slightly higher ground above the seasonal flood, for the creek that opened away to the sea, and for the river that watered the fields and filled the wells. The soil of the plain is the deep black cotton earth that the country yields, a heavy clay that swells and holds the water when it is wet and shrinks and opens when it is dry, good for the grain but treacherous to build upon. And the land gives almost no stone of its own, neither rock for walls nor pebbles for paving, only the endless silt, so that everything raised here had to be made from the clay underfoot and from what the rivers and the sea could bring. The country about the rise was not empty, for other settlements of the same people lay scattered across the peninsula and along the rivers, smaller towns and villages of farmers and herders and craftsmen who worked the same black soil and traded along the same creeks, and the place stood among them where the inland country met the sea. Birds came to the wet plain in their seasons, the cranes and the storks and the long-legged waders that stalked the shallows, the ducks that gathered on the standing water of the monsoon, and the herons that stood motionless at the edge of the creek, and the flats teemed with the small life of an estuary, the shellfish and the crabs and the fish that ran up with the tide. Beneath the black soil lay beds of the hard lime nodules the country breeds, gathering in the clay, and these were taken up for the lime that bound and sealed. For in a land without rock, every hard thing had to be sought and saved. The flatness of it all is difficult to hold in the mind, a country with no fold and no rise of its own making, where water stands where it falls and runs only where the faint fall of the land allows it, where the horizon is a full circle unbroken, and where a thing raised by human hands, a platform, a wall, a mound, stands out against the level as the one upright fact in a world of horizontals. Into that flatness the town was set, a made island of order on a plain that offered nothing but its silt and its water and its salt. Through the long dry season the plain bakes pale and hard, and the black earth opens in a net of fissures that run deep into the ground, drinking the last of the moisture, and the creeks shrink back to threads of standing water gone half to salt, and the whole country seems to hold its breath and wait. Then the southwest monsoon comes up off the sea in the height of the summer, and the rains fall heavy and warm across the flat land, and the soil that had opened closes again and holds the water like a sponge. The rivers rise and spread beyond their banks, the creek swells with the inland flow, and with the tide pushed far up it, and for a season the level country becomes a sheet of shallow water, broken only by the rises that people had the wit to build upon. The plain gives and the plain takes, year upon year, the salt creeping up through the ground in the dry months, and the fresh water washing it down again in the wet. And into this slow turning of wet and dry, the town was fitted, raised on its platform above the worst of the flood, and tied by its creek to the moving water that gave it its reason. Over the centuries since, the sea has drawn back from this corner of the gulf, and the creeks have filled with their own silt, so that the rise now stands stranded in a dry saline expanse a long way from any open water, and the tide that once came up to the wharves comes no more. What was a margin of the sea is now a margin of memory, a low ground in a wide flat country where the rivers have shifted and the gulf has gone, and the wind moves over the salt plain in the early light with nothing to turn it. Yet the lie of the land still tells the reason of the place, the higher ground and the old course of the creek, and the gentle fall of the country toward the vanished water. And on that ground, between the river and the retreated sea, the measured outline of a town still rests. The town was set out as a single ordered whole upon a great platform of mud brick raised above the level of the flood, and within that platform it was divided into two joined parts, a higher quarter to the south that the excavators came to call the Acropolis, and a wider lower quarter to the north where the houses and the workshops stood. The two laid together on one rise and bound by the same streets and drains into one settlement rather than two. The whole of it was held within an embankment of mud brick that ran about the town as a wall against the water. Thick at its base and sloped, a made bank raised and raised again over the life of the place. For the people understood that the flood was the one enemy that would come, and they girdled their work against it. The streets were drawn with a care that is plain even now, running roughly to the four quarters of the compass, and crossing one another to mark out blocks of houses, the main ways broad enough for the passage of carts, and the lesser lanes narrow between the close walls. And along them ran the channels that carried the water away. Almost everything was built of brick that had been fired hard in kilns rather than merely dried in the sun. And this was no small matter, for the firing of brick in such quantity asked for fuel and labor and skill, and the people of the drier inland cities of the Indus often built in sun-dried brick alone. Here on the wet and saline ground, where unbaked brick would have drawn up the salt and the damp and slumped into mud within a few seasons, the fired brick was the only sound answer, and so the town was raised in baked clay, laid in regular courses, and bedded in mud mortar. The bricks themselves were cut to a fixed proportion, their length twice their width, and their width twice their thickness, the same ratio that held across the whole world of the Indus, from the great northern cities to this small port on the southern sea, so that a wall here was laid to the same rule as a wall 1,000 kilometers away, a quiet sign of how far the order of that world reached. Through the lower town stood wells of fired brick, round shafts lined with wedge-shaped bricks made to the curve, from which the households drew their water, and these were many, set through the quarters so that no house stood far from its water. Beside many of the houses lay platforms of brick for bathing, their floors laid smooth and sloped to a corner where the water ran off into a drain, and the drains were the quiet marvel of the place, a system of channels laid along the streets and covered with bricks and stone slabs, fed by the smaller drains of the houses and the bathing places, running with a true and gentle fall through the body of the town to soak away at its margin, so that the streets were kept dry and the standing water that breeds sickness was led away. On the Acropolis, the raised southern quarter, stood the larger buildings of the town. The platform there built up higher still above the lower quarter, and paved and drained. And chief among the buildings was a great block of brick platforms set close together in rows and divided by narrow channels that let the air move beneath and between the stored goods. A building the excavators read as a warehouse, where the bales and bundles that passed through the port could be held up off the damp ground and kept until the boats came for them. Of the many cubical mud brick blocks that made the floor of that warehouse, only some still stand, the rest worn away by flood and time. But the plan of it is clear. The goods raised on their pedestals, with the air running under them, in a country where the damp would have rotted anything left on the ground. The making of so much fired brick was itself a great labor of the place, for the clay had to be dug and tempered and shaped in molds to the fixed measure, dried, and then stacked and burned in kilns with fuel that the bare plain did not freely give. And the quantity of baked brick laid into the platform and the walls and the wells and the drains and the basin speaks of years of that steady work. The drains where they left the town ran into pits lined with brick and with pierced jars set one upon another that took the water down into the ground away from the houses, a careful finishing of the system at its far end. The town itself was not large, a few hectares of close-built ground that a person might walk the length of in a short while. Yet within that compass lay the whole apparatus of an ordered settlement, the divided quarters, the squared streets, the drains and wells and baths, the warehouse and the wharf, fitted together as tightly as the bricks themselves. Around the warehouse lay the houses of those who oversaw the work, larger and better drained than the dwellings of the lower town, with their own wells and bathing floors and paved courts, and the whole of the Acropolis was set a little apart and a little above, looking down over the workshops and the streets and out toward the eastern edge where the great basin lay. The houses of the lower town were modest and well made, of several rooms about a small court, their floors of beaten earth or brick, their walls plain and thick, the cooking done at hearths within, and the water carried in from the well and let out by the drain, and they stood wall against wall along the lanes in the manner of a crowded working town, some of them giving onto the street through a narrow entry, and some opening only inward upon their court. The order of the whole is what holds the eye, the squared streets and the covered drains and the fixed measure of the brick, the warehouse on its platforms and the wells set through the quarters, the girdling embankment and the careful raising of the entire town above the reach of the flood, so that what was built here on the edge of the gulf was not a huddle of dwellings, but a planned settlement, measured and drained and fired against the water, a thing made by people who knew their ground and meant to hold it. In the first cool of the morning, before the sun had climbed far enough to press its weight on the plain, the lower town woke to the work that was its whole reason. For Lothal, above all else, was a place of making, and the day began with the opening of the workshops. Water was drawn from the brick wells in the half-light and carried in jars to the houses and the working courts. The hearths were fed and brought to life, and the small kilns of the bead makers were laid with fuel and kindled and brought slowly up to the heat they would hold through the day, the smoke rising thin and straight in the still air over the close roofs of the quarter. In one walled court of the lower town stood a workshop given wholly to the making of beads, with its furnace at one side and its working floors about it, and a row of small rooms around the court where the makers sat. And the ground of that court was thick with the leavings of the trade, the broken blanks and the half-drilled stones, and the chips and the fine pale dust of grinding worked into the very floor by the feet of those who had labored there, so that the place could be read for what it was long after the last bead had been strung. There the makers settled to their slow and exacting work as the light strengthened, taking up the rough pieces of carnelian and agate that had been carried in from the hills, roughing them to shape against the grindstones, and then beginning the long, patient boring of the hole that would let a bead be strung, turning the fine, hard drill with a bow and feeding it with grit and water. A labor of hours and sometimes of days for a single long stone. The drills themselves were marvels of the craft, tipped with a stone harder than the bead it bored, made and used with a skill that let a hole be driven true down the length of a finger-long carnelian without the stone splitting, and the rhythm of that boring, the bow drawn back and forth and the drill turning, was the undersound of the workshop through the day. Others worked the steatite, the soft, pale stone that could be cut and ground with ease and then fired hard, shaping from it the tiny disc beads so small that a man might hold thousands in his cupped hands, threading them as they were made onto cords of fiber and firing whole strings of them at once, and the dust of that work hung in the morning air and settled on everything. Out in the streets, the ordinary traffic of a working town moved through the lanes, the water and the grain and the fuel, and the raw stone passing from hand to hand and house to house, the potters at their wheels in their own quarter turning out the day's vessels, the coppersmiths at their small furnaces drawing the metal to heat, the shell workers cutting the bangles from the thick seashells brought up from the Gulf, sawing the rings from the whorl of the shell and grinding them smooth. The grain was ground at the saddle querns for the day's bread. The cattle and the goats were let out to the rougher ground beyond the fields, and the women and the older children took up the spinning and the weaving and the grinding that filled the hours within the houses, the whir of the spindle and the knock of the loom and the steady rasp of stone on stone, making the undersound of the morning beneath the work of the kilns and the drills. Beyond the houses, where the streets gave out onto the fields, the farmers went out in the cool to the watered ground, to the wheat and the barley, standing in the dry season plots and the stubble of the last harvest, and the herdsmen drove the humped cattle and the goats and the sheep out to the grazing on the saltier margins where the plow did not reach. Down at the creek, the fishermen went out with the tide, with their nets and their lines and their flat boats, to take the fish and the shellfish that the estuary gave, and came back along the bank as the water turned. Children ran the lanes between the houses, playing with the little carts of clay with their turning wheels, and the whistles made in the form of birds. Dogs lay in the early sun, and the smoke of 100 small fires drifted up over the town and out across the flat country. At the eastern edge of the town, the great brick basin lay open to the morning tide, its still water brightening as the sun came up, and along its wharf the work of the port went on, the checking of the bundles in the warehouse, the mending of the boats drawn up at the side, the readying of the goods that would go down to the sea when the season and the wind allowed, the carrying of jars and bales from the storehouses to the water's edge. In the bead court, the older makers set the younger to the simpler tasks, the rough grinding and the sorting and the threading of the small fired discs, keeping the boring of the long carnelian to the practiced hands. And so the craft passed down within the court from the one generation to the next, the children learning at the side of their elders the feel of the stone and the turning of the drill. The smell of the workshops hung over the quarter, the smoke of the kilns, the dust of the groundstone, the wet grit of the boring, the warm metal at the coppersmith's hearth, and mixed with it the smell of the morning bread and the dung fires and the salt creek beyond. Water was carried again and again from the wells through the morning, for the boring and the grinding and the cooking and the bathing all drank it, and the brick mouths of the wells were busy places where the talk of the quarter was passed along with the jars. So the town filled with its work as the morning wore on, the kilns at their heat, and the drills at their turning, and the wheels at their spinning, the whole rise busy with the patient making of small and precious things. And over it all the light came clear and golden across the flat country, and the smoke of the morning fires drifted out across the plain toward the water. The true wealth of Lothal lay not in the land about it, which gave only grain and grazing and the silt for its bricks, but in the working of hard and colored stone into ornament, and above all in the bead, for this was one of the great bead-making towns of the ancient world. The stone the makers prized most was carnelian, the deep orange-red stone that the Indus craftsmen knew how to bring to its richest color by careful and repeated heating, ground and shaped into beads long and short, and bored through their length with drills of a harder stone, the boring so fine and so true through stones of such hardness that the skill of it has been studied with wonder ever since. The longest of these carnelian beads, the slender barrel beads as long as a finger and drilled the whole way through, were among the most prized things the Indus world made, and beads of just this kind, carried out by sea and by land, were laid in the royal graves of the cities of Mesopotamia far to the west, so that the work of these courts on the Gulf of Gujarat came to rest in the tombs of distant kings. The makers knew too how to write upon the stone, etching pale designs into the red carnelian by laying on an alkaline paste and heating it so that the surface whitened where it was drawn, leaving lines and eyes and patterns of white standing in the orange, a craft particular to the Indus and prized abroad. Beside the carnelian they worked agate in its bands of gray and white and brown, and jasper and other hard stones carried in from the hill country to the north and east. And they made too the smallest beads of all from steatite, the soft stone ground to a paste and shaped, and then fired to a pale hardness. Disc beads so minute that they were strung in their thousands into broad collars and belts, and from gold drawn out fine they made beads smaller still. From the Gulf came the thick seashell, cut and ground into bangles to be worn in stacks upon the arm, and into ladles and inlay and gaming pieces and small worked objects, the waste of that cutting left in heaps where the shell workers had sat. Copper was brought in as metal and as ore, and worked at the furnaces into tools and fish hooks and points and flat axes, and into rings and ornaments, hammered and cast and finished. And there was faience, the bright glazed paste, shaped into beads and small things, and fired to a glassy skin. The potters turned a fine ware of red clay, and painted it in black with the designs of their tradition, bands and loops, and the forms of plants and beasts and of birds. The dish set on a tall stand, the great storage jar, the small painted pot, and among the vessels lifted from the ground was a painted jar carrying the scene of a bird perched at a tree above a vessel, a scene that recalls a fable of a thirsting bird told in those lands long after the town was gone, set down by a potter's hand more than 4,000 years before. The order and the measure of all this making was kept with a care that is itself among the marvels of the place. For the goods were weighed against cubical weights cut from chert to a fixed and rising scale, the smaller weights doubling one upon another and the larger running in tens, a system held in common across the whole Indus world, so that a weight at Lothal answered exactly to a weight in the distant northern cities. Length was measured no less finely, and from the ground here came a short rule of ivory marked along its edge in divisions of less than 2 millimeters apiece, among the most precise of all the measuring instruments that survived from the ancient world, the work of people who cared to measure small things truly. And there was a thick ring of shell, ground flat and cut with lines, that may have served to sight an angle or a bearing. The people grew and worked cotton as well, the plant that the wet plain would bear, spinning its fiber into thread on the small weighted whorls found through the houses and weaving it into the cloth that was among the goods most prized abroad. And they worked and colored it in ways the cloth itself, being perishable, no longer shows, though its making is read in the spindle whorls and in the word of the distant records that speak of the cloth of the eastern land. The flint and chert for the small sharp blades that every craft needed, the knives and the saws and the drill tips, were struck from cores of fine stone carried in from far-off beds where such stone was quarried, and these long, straight blades, broken to length, did the fine cutting of the shell and the wood and the daily work of the kitchen. The copper came from the mines of the hills, and perhaps from across the sea, brought in as ingot and as ore, and was smelted and cast and beaten at the town's own furnaces into the things a town needs, the awls and the chisels and the fish hooks and the flat blades, alongside the ornaments of finer work. The pottery ran to many forms beyond the painted jar, the dish on its tall stand, the great storage jar taller than a child, the small cup, the perforated vessel pierced all over with holes that may have strained a drink or held a glowing coal, each turned on the wheel and fired in the kiln to the same red ware. And over the trade lay the seals, small squares of steatite carved in reverse with the figure of a beast, the humped bull or the short-horned ox or a creature of more than one nature, and above the beast a line of the signs of a script that has not yet been read. And these seals pressed into soft clay left their mark upon the bundles and the jars that moved through the town, the sign of an owner or a house or an office set upon the goods. So the materials of Lothal were the small, the hard, the bright, and the carefully measured, the carnelian and the shell, and the steatite and the copper and the gold, the weights and the rule and the carved seal, the whole craft of a town that lived by turning stone into ornament and ornament into trade. At the eastern side of the town, along its lower edge where the ground fell toward the old creek, lay the work that has drawn more attention than any other on the mound, a great basin of fired brick set into the earth, a long rectangle running more than 200 meters from end to end and some 35 meters across, with walls of baked brick that stand even now to many courses above the floor, raised true and plumb and bedded with care. At one corner, an inlet channel ran in from the tidal creek, bringing the water up into the basin on the flood, and at the other end an opening in the wall is read as a spillway, a way of letting the surplus run off, while a lowered barrier, set in grooves still to be seen in the brickwork, held back enough water to keep the basin full as the tide outside fell away, so that the boats within would not be left aground when the sea drew back. The excavators who uncovered it understood it as a dockyard, a basin made so that the flat boats of the coasting trade could be floated in on the high tide and held in the standing water beside the wharf and the warehouse while they were loaded and unloaded. And if that reading holds, it is the oldest such basin yet known anywhere, a made harbor set into the land at the head of the gulf, the work of people who thought hard about the tide and bent it to their use. Others have read the basin instead as a great tank for the storing of water in a thirsty country, and the question has been weighed back and forth across the years, the one side pointing to the inland droughts, and the other to the brick wharf and the inlet from the salt creek. Yet the scale of the brickwork, the channel from the tidal water, the platform of the wharf along its western side, and the warehouse set close above it on the Acropolis, all lean the weight of the matter toward the harbor, toward a town that built itself a dock against the breathing of an extreme tide. Beside the warehouse, the ground gave up the surest sign of what passed through the place, for there were found many small lumps of clay, the ceilings that had been pressed against the fastenings of bundles and jars and then hardened, and on the backs of these ceilings, where the clay had taken the shape of what it was pressed against, lay the clear print of cord and of woven matting and of coarse cloth and of the reed packing, the very marks of the bundled goods that had been tied and sealed and stored against the coming of the boats, some of them stamped on the face with more than one seal, as though they had passed through more than one hand. From the same trade came a seal of a kind not native to the Indus, round rather than square and carved in a manner that belongs to the commerce of the Persian Gulf, a single small object that ties this town on the coast of Gujarat to the island of Dilmun in the Gulf, and through it to the great cities of Mesopotamia far to the west, where the records of that distant land speak of ships coming from the eastern sea bearing carnelian and ivory and rare woods. For that was the shape of the trade, the goods of the Indus going down to the sea and out across the Gulf, the beads of carnelian and agate, the bangles and inlay of shell, the ivory worked and raw, and the fine cotton cloth that the western cities prized and that this wet country could grow. And back along the same sea roads came the copper and the other goods that the inland did not hold, carried hand to hand and hull to hull between the coasts. Inland too the trade ran, up the rivers and across the country to the smaller Harappan towns of the peninsula, and on to the greater cities of the Indus, the raw stone and the metal coming down to the workshops and the finished beads going out, so that Lothal sat as a knot in a wide net of paths, gathering in the stone of the hills and the shell of the sea and the copper of the far mines, and sending out the worked ornament by river and by tide. The records of the western cities name a far eastern land from which these goods came, a land of carnelian and of ivory and of fine wood and of the cloth of trees. And though no single tablet names this town, the things that the western scribes listed are the very things that the workshops here made and the warehouse here stored, so that the trade of the distant land and the trade of this plain are read as one. What came back along the sea is harder to hold, for much of it was metal and stuff that was melted or used up, the copper above all, and perhaps the wool and the oil and the goods of the western farms, carried east in the holds that had gone west full of beads and shell and cloth. The town stood as a gate between two worlds, the inland country of the Indus with its stone and its grain and its great cities, and the sea road that ran down the gulf and across to the gulf of the further west. And through that gate the goods passed in both directions, weighed against the chert cubes, sealed with the carved steatite, and entered, it may be, in records upon stuff that has not lasted. The boats themselves are gone, being of wood and reed, but their shape is kept in small models of clay found on the site, flat-bottomed craft with a place for a mast, the very form that could be floated up a shallow creek and into a brick basin on the flood. The basin and the wharf and the warehouse, the weights and the seals and the ceilings, the round gulf seal and the clay boats, together tell of a place whose whole life was the moving and the measuring of goods, a small town on a salt plain that reached across an ocean. As the long day wore down and the heat went out of the plain, the light turned and lengthened and ran low and golden across the flat country, and the town that had labored since dawn began to gather itself toward the evening. In the workshops the firing was let down for the day, the kilns banked, and the furnaces left to cool, the bow drills laid aside, and the beads that had been roughed and ground and bored through the long hours were gathered up and counted and put away, the working floors swept of their dust and their chips, the precious leavings hoarded even now, for the smallest fragment of carnelian or gold was not let go. The shell workers set down their saws, and the potters left their wheels still. The coppersmiths drew the last work from the cooling hearths, and through the lower town the makers turned from their crafts to the ordinary evening of a household. In the houses the second meal of the day was set to cook over the rekindled hearths. The bread of wheat and of barley, the rice and the small millets that the wet plain could be made to give, and with them the fish drawn from the creek and the gulf, the shellfish gathered from the flats, and the flesh of cattle and of sheep and goat, the smoke of the cooking rising again over the roofs as it had risen in the morning, and the smell of it moving along the lanes. Within the rooms, the work that needed no daylight went on by the small flame of the lamp, the spinning of the cotton and the wool into thread on the weighted spindle, the twisting of cord, the stringing of the day's beads, the mending of a net, the shaping of a little clay into the figure of a bull or a cart for a child, and on the floors of some houses lay the boards and the worked pieces of the games the people played in the evening, counters of shell and stone moved across squares scratched in clay. Water was carried a last time from the wells for the evening bathing, and ran off down the covered drains beneath the lanes, and the wells stood quiet in the cooling courts as the light failed. This was the same town and the same day seen now from its other end, the morning's making answered by the evening's rest, the work of the hands giving way to the gathering of the family about the hearth, the streets that had filled with traffic falling still as the people drew indoors, and the repetition was the very rhythm of the place. Dawn and dusk, the kiln lit and the kiln banked, the water carried out and the water carried in, a town that lived by the same round of hours day upon day for the length of many lives. About the hearths the families gathered as the dark came on, the food shared out in the red dishes and the cups, the talk running low, the elders speaking and the children listening, the day's work told over and the next day's reckoned, and the small flame of the oil lamp throwing its light up the plain walls of the rooms. Over the flat country the dark was complete, and the stars stood out in their multitude, wheeling slowly through the night above the level plain, as they had wheeled above it before any town was raised, and the people who watched them had set their streets and perhaps their works by the rising and the setting of the lights, reading the turning of the year in the sky, aye, as they read it in the rains and the tides. The night sounds came up across the rise, the dogs of the town answering one another, the call of a bird from the creek, the wind moving over the embankment and through the lanes, the small settling sounds of a place at rest. Those who kept the goods walked the warehouse and the wharf in the dark, or sat at the gate of the embankment where the way ran down to the water, watching over the bundles that were the wealth of the town until the morning, and the boats. Beyond the houses, at the eastern edge, the tide came up the creek in the dusk and lay dark and still in the great basin, and the bundled goods waited under their seals in the warehouse for the boats that the season would bring, the wharf empty now, and the water rising quietly against the brick. The children were called in from the lanes, the cattle were folded, the lamps were lit within the rooms, and the close-set houses of the lower town drew in upon themselves one by one as the dark came down over the level country, and the last of the light went from the western sky out over the vanished sea. The plain that had glared all day under the sun lay cool and gray and enormous in the dusk, the rise of the town the one made thing upon it, and from the houses came the low sound of the evening, the talk and the soft work that needed no light, the grinding of a little grain for the morning, until that too quieted, and the town slept above its drains and its wells, with the tide lying full and silent in the basin at its edge. The care that the people of Lothal gave to their dead and to their offerings is read in the ground plainly enough, without need to reach beyond what the spade has turned up, for they left the signs of their observance in the same measured way they left the signs of their trade. Away to the northwest of the town lay the burying ground, and there the dead were laid in pits dug into the earth, set out at length with their heads to one quarter, and about them were placed the pots and the ornaments that went with them into the ground, the everyday vessels that might hold food and drink, and the strings of beads and the bangles of shell that they had worn in life, so that the dead went down furnished much as they had lived. Among these graves were several that held not one body but two, a man and a woman laid together side by side in a single pit, a manner of burial marked enough to be noticed and counted by those who uncovered it, and much considered since, though what bound the two and brought them to the one grave is not told by the bones and the pots alone, and the people who study the place have been careful not to put words into so quiet a record, reading only what the ground allows. Within the town itself, set among the houses and the workshops, stood small structures and platforms of brick that held ash and burnt earth and the charred bones of animals and grains, and these are read as altars where offerings were given to the fire, of a kind that has been found at other settlements of the Indus, the burning of grain and of beast as part of the round of the household's observance, the fire kept and fed in its small appointed place. The terracotta gave its own evidence, for the people shaped and fired small figures in great number, the humped bull and the cattle and the dog and the bird and the human form, and these were left about the houses and the lanes and the courts, the ordinary furniture of belief, handled and broken and discarded and made again, so common that they cannot have been rare or set apart things, but the daily small gods of a working people. There were models, too, of carts and of boats in clay, and rattles and whistles, and the little stamp seals that may have served as much to ward as to mark, and beads worn perhaps as much for keeping as for show. The graves were dug in the burying ground, and the dead set down with care, some with many pots and some with few. The difference perhaps of what the household could give, or of the standing of the one who had died, and the bodies lay extended at length, with the goods set near the head and the feet. The strings of beads that went into the ground are among the finest the site has given, the same carnelian and steatite and shell that the living wore, so that the dead carried with them the very work of the town, the ornament of the place laid down in the earth with its makers. Whether the paired burials held kin or companions, and whether the two went into the ground together or were laid in turn, the bones alone do not say, and the careful watchers of the site have read them as a thing observed rather than a thing explained, a quiet particular set beside the more numerous single graves. Within the houses there may have stood small niches or set-apart corners where a figure was kept or an offering laid, though the slumping of the walls has taken most such things, and the little seals, worn perhaps on a cord at the throat, may have served the one who wore them as a guard as much as a mark, the carved beast and the unread signs standing between the wearer and what was feared. No great house of a god has been found on the rise, no raised temple, no image set up to be approached, and that absence is itself a kind of evidence, of a people whose observance lived in the house and the court and the grave rather than in any single sacred precinct. What runs through all of it is the same temper that runs through the rest of the town, a thing kept close and kept in measure, the dead laid in order with their goods about them, the fire given its offering on its small brick altar, the figures shaped and kept among the living, observance woven quietly into the fabric of the working town, rather than set apart in any great and separate house. For there is no temple here that the ground has shown, no towering shrine, only the altar in the court, and the figure on the shelf and the grave at the town's edge. The bones of the dead, where they were studied, told of a people of ordinary stature who had known the labors of their crafts and the wear of their years, buried young and old alike, the children too given their small graves and their few pots. The fire altars were not raised once and forgotten, but tended across the generations, fed with the same offerings of grain and beast, so that the keeping of the fire ran on as the keeping of the trade ran on. an inherited round of small acts, repeated without change through the long life of the town. And the figures of clay, broken and discarded and shaped anew without end, speak of an observance that was made and remade by the hands of every household, never set in any single great image, but worked over and over in the cheap and ready clay of the plain, as common in the houses as the pots and the spindle whorls and the beads. The dead lay near, the fire burned near, the small clay forms stood near, and the people moved among them as they moved among their looms and their kilns, without division, the keeping of the unseen folded into the keeping of the day. What the ground keeps here is the steady, ordinary keeping of the dead, and the fire and the small clay gods within the same walls where the beads were bored and the boats were loaded, a town whose belief, like its trade, was a matter of careful and unhurried order. The year on the Baal plain turned hard between the wet and the dry, with little of the soft gradation of gentler lands, and the whole life of the port was set to that turning. Through the greater part of the year the country lay parched under a high sun, the black soil drying and opening in its deep fissures, the creeks shrinking back to threads and pools gone half to salt, the grazing browning off and the salt creeping up through the ground until the plain glittered faintly white in the heat. And in that long dry season the sea trade lay quiet, the boats drawn up on the bank, the winds not yet turned to carry them. In those dry months the work of the town turned inward to its making, the bead courts busy, the kilns at their heat, the warehouse filling with the goods that the boats would later carry, the people living on the grain of the last harvest, stored in their jars and on the cattle and the fish, and watching the sky to the south and west for the first weight of cloud. Then in the height of the summer the southwest monsoon came up off the ocean, and the rains fell heavy and warm across the flat land day upon day, and the plain that had cracked and whitened drank the water and closed and greened, the soil holding the rain in its body, the rivers rising and spreading far beyond their banks, the creek filling with the inland flow and with the tide that the wet season pushed far up the land. It was in this season of high water that the harbor came into its own, for only when the creek was full and the tidal reach ran strong could the boats be floated up the channel and into the basin, and only when the winds blew steady down the gulf could the coasting vessels run to the further shores and home again, so that the trade of the town beat once a year like a slow pulse with the coming of the rain. The goods gathered through the dry months and held under seal in the warehouse going out at last when the water rose. The fields, too, were sown to the rain, the grain of the wet season going in as the soil softened and coming ripe as it dried, and a second sowing taking the lingering moisture of the cooling months, so that the plain that fed the town was worked twice round the turning year, the wheat and the barley and the rice and the millet each in its season, and the threshing floors busy when the harvest came. The winds themselves kept the calendar of the sea, for the same monsoon that brought the rain reversed itself with the turning of the year, blowing up from the southwest across the ocean through the wet months, and then falling and turning to blow down from the northeast as the land cooled, and the boats of the coasting trade were bound to that turning, going out on the one wind and coming home on the other, so that a voyage down the gulf and across to the further shore was a thing of seasons, begun and ended by the breath of the sky. The heat of the late dry season was the hardest time, the plain glaring and opened, the water low and brackish, the people keeping to the shade of the rooms through the worst of the day, and working in the cool of the morning and the evening, watching always to the south for the first towers of cloud that would bring the rain and the rising of the creek and the season of the boats. When the rain broke at last, it came with a force that changed the world in a day. The dust laid, the air cooled, the dry channels running, the opened plain greening within the week, and the round of sowing and of loading and of voyaging began again. Yet the same rains that filled the basin and floated the boats and watered the fields were the standing threat to the town, for the flood that opened the sea road could as easily break across the streets and throw down the walls and bury the work of years in silt, and the people knew it, and much of what they built was an answer to the water. The raising of the whole town upon its platform above the flood level, the girdling embankment of mud brick thickened and heightened over the generations, the building in fired brick that the wet could not melt, the deep ordered drains that led the water away, the very choosing of the higher ground, all of it was a holding of the line against the river and the tide, a yearly reckoning with the water that gave the port its life and threatened its undoing in the same season. The flood, when it came hard, left its mark not only on the town, but on the memory of those who lived through it. And the raising of the embankment after each was a labor shared across the whole settlement. The moving of earth and the laying of brick against the next rising of the water, a thing the people did together as they did the keeping of the drains and the wells. In the worst of the dry, the brackish water and the failing wells must have pressed the town hard, and the storing of grain and the keeping of the cattle were the margin between plenty and want, so that the two seasons set the bounds of the year not only for the trade in the fields, but for the very holding of life on the plain. Between the extremes lay the short kinder weeks, the cool of the months after the rain, when the plain was green and the harvest in and the air mild, the easiest season of the year, when the work was lighter and the stores were full and the boats were made ready for the turning of the wind. So the year came round, the long dry waiting and the sudden green abundance of the rains, the harvest of the watered fields, and the gathering of the fish from the swollen creek, the loading of the boats on the high water, and their return before the season closed. And the town lived by reading the sky and the tide and the wind, set like its own brickwork foursquare against the turning of the wet and the dry. The quieting of Lothal was written in mud rather than in fire, and it came not as a single ending, but as a slow wearing down across the generations, the work of the same water the town had always lived against. Through the upper levels of the mound run layers of silt, more than one of them, the marks of floods that rose at last too high and came too often, breaking over the platform and the embankment that had been raised to hold them off, throwing down walls, choking the streets, and filling the basin and its channel with the river's burden of mud. After each such flood, the people raised the town again, and the will to do so was strong, for again and again the brick was relaid, and the drains recut, and the life of the port taken up once more. Yet with each raising a little of the old order was let go, the streets laid less straight, the brick of the fallen houses gathered up and used again, the great works of the harbor and the warehouse patched, rather than restored to what they had been, so that the later town came to sit upon the wreck of the earlier as a poorer and a smaller thing. The creek that had joined the town to the sea began to silt and to wander as the rivers shifted their courses across the flat country, and the tide drew back, and the way to the open water that had been the whole reason of the place grew shallow and uncertain, and at last failed, and with it failed the trade. The wide net of paths that had brought the stone down from the hills and carried the beads out across the gulf loosened as the greater cities of the Indus themselves drew down and changed in those same centuries. The order that had held a single measure of brick and weight across 1,000 kilometers coming apart, the script falling out of use, the seals no longer cut, and the demand for the worked ornament thinned, so that the later people of the rise lived a smaller life of farming and of local craft, a settlement of the late Harappan kind, no longer reaching across the sea. The pottery of those last phases changed its character, a different ware coming in, and the fine old order of the weights and the long carnelian beads and the sealed bundles passed quietly out of the record, not broken off but faded down. The early floods the town met and mastered, raising its embankment higher and its platform thicker, recutting its drains, relaying its walls, so that for a long while the place came back stronger from each rising of the water, and the will and the means to do so were the very mark of its prosperity. But the floods came again, and the means thinned, and a time came when the town that was rebuilt was smaller than the one thrown down, the people drawing back onto the higher ground of the Acropolis and letting the lower quarters go, the bead courts and the wide streets not taken up again, the warehouse no longer kept in its old order. The wider world of which the town was a part was changing in those same centuries, the great rivers of the Indus shifting their courses far to the north, the rains, it may be, growing less sure, the order that had bound 100 towns and cities into one measure of brick and weight and seal loosening and coming apart, the cities themselves dwindling, so that the quieting of the trade at Lothal was not a thing of the one place alone, but the local face of a great change that ran across the whole land. With the trade gone, the reason of the port was gone, and the later people of the Rise lived as farmers and herders and workers of the local craft, their pottery of a different make, their dead laid in a different way, their life turned inland and small, no longer the gathering knot of an ocean trade, but one more village on a wide plain among many. The town did not end in a day, and was not thrown down by any enemy that the ground records, for there is no burning, no slaughter, no broken line of defense, only the silt and the slow loosening and the long drawing down, the work of the workshops fading, the harbor silting, the streets emptying house by house, as the people moved to other ground where the water still served them and the trade still ran. For a while the smaller late town kept something of the old life, the people still drawing water from the brick wells, still shaping a few beads, still laying their dead in the ground, but the great work stood unmended about them, the basin silting, the warehouse fallen, the embankment breached and not made good, and the settlement shrank in upon itself season by season. There was no one moment that could be called the end, no last day marked in the ground, only the long thinning of the smoke over the roofs and the lengthening of the silences between the seasons of work, until at the last the smoke did not rise at all. In time the rise was let go altogether, and the plain took it back, the basin filling with mud and the rain, the platform slumping at its edges, the brick walls weathering down under the monsoons of season after season, the salt closing quietly over the lanes where the carts had run, until the made town sank back into the level country it had been raised above. The site is still there. The city is not. What had been a harbor at the head of the gulf became a low mound in a dry plain, the sea gone from beside it, the boats gone from the basin, the makers gone from the workshops, and over the long centuries the grass and the salt and the silence came down over the measured order of the place and held it. What remains now is a low double rise of weathered brick on the wide flat plain near the village of Saraguala, far inland from any open water, the two joined quarters of the old town still legible in the lie of the ground, the higher southern Acropolis and the lower northern quarter, traced out in the lines of fired brick that the excavations laid bare in the middle of the last century, when the place was uncovered season by season and read out of the earth. Walking the rise, one can follow the run of the main streets and the lesser lanes, the squared blocks of the houses, the round mouths of the brick wells, and the channels of the drains, still set along the ways with their covering slabs here and there in place. And on the Acropolis, the courses of the warehouse platforms still stand in their rows, with the narrow gaps between them, where the air once moved beneath the stored goods. The great basin lies open at the eastern edge, a long rectangle of brick walls, holding a still sheet of rainwater through the wet season and showing a cracked, dry floor in the heat. And at its corners, the inlet and the spillway can be read where they meet the line of the old silted channel, the made harbor kept by the dry ground long after the tide forsook it, the grooves for the barrier still cut in the brick. The embankment that girdled the town can be traced as a low bank about the rise, worn but holding its line, and the burying ground lies where it lay, to the northwest, given up now. The beads of carnelian and agate and steatite, the bangles of shell, the cubical weights of chert, the fine ivory rule with its minute divisions, the seals and the ceilings with their cord-marked backs, the round gulf seal, the clay models of boats, and the painted jar with its bird at the tree, were all lifted from this ground in the years of the excavation, and are kept now in the museum that stands beside the site, where the measured order of the port is set out room by room for those who come to see it. The small bright work of the town, gathered out of the earth that held it, and laid behind glass in the order of its making. The town was found and read in a long campaign of digging through the seasons of the middle of the last century, when those who came to the rise cut down through its layers and laid open its plan, the streets and the houses, the warehouse and the wells, the burying ground, and above all the great basin at the eastern edge, and set down what they found in measured record, so that the place could be known. From that work came the reading of the basin as a doc, and the long weighing of that reading against the other. And the question is held open still by those who study the Indus, the brick rectangle standing as both the proudest claim of the site and its quietest matter of debate, a thing measured and described in full, whose use is argued from the same evidence by careful people who differ. The small things lifted from the ground, the beads and the weights and the rule, the seals and the ceilings, the painted pots and the clay boats and the figures, were carried into the keeping of the museum that stands beside the rise, and there they are set out in the order of their making and their use, the work of the bead court and the warehouse and the household ranged behind glass for those who come across the plain to see them. The plain itself goes on as it always went, the village near at hand working the black soil through the 2 seasons, the cattle crossing the dry mound, the herons standing in the rainwater that gathers in the old basin through the monsoon, the salt whitening the flats in the heat, and over it the same enormous sky and the same flat horizon that the people of the town knew. The gulf has gone from the horizon, and the rivers have wandered far from their old beds, and the salt plain runs flat and empty to the seam of the sky as it did before the town was ever raised, the wind moving over it in the early light and again at dusk, the herons standing in the rainwater of the basin in the wet months, and the cattle of the village crossing the dry mound in the heat. Those who come to the rise walk a quiet ground, the brick warm underfoot in the sun, the lines of the old walls low about them, the great basin lying open with its still water or its dry floor according to the season, and the museum near at hand holding the small bright work that the earth gave up. The plan that was read out of the layers is set out for them, the divided town, the squared streets, the wells and the drains, the warehouse and the wharf and the dock, the whole measured order of a port that lived by the moving of small precious things across a sea that has since drawn away. What was raised here was raised in measure, and in measure it has come down, the bones of the town laid bare and recorded, the order of it kept even now that the life of it is gone. The pattern is still legible. In the long evening, the brick basin lies holding the color of the sky where it once held the tide, the low walls darkening, the lines of the streets fading into the level ground, the plain going gray and then gray-blue, and then dim around the quiet outline of a town that measured small things, truly, and reached once across a sea, and the dark comes down over it gently as the light goes out of the west.